everybody, and welcome back to the art table for our 13th episode, where we are going to do something just a little bit special. Today we are going to focus not just on art, but on one of my other favorite subjects, which is science. And we're specifically going to focus on the topic of animals. From our very first forms of artwork, people have been obsessed with animals. We see them in pretty much every form of cave painting that was performed by ancient humans. This example happens to be an imitation cave painting, which means that it's not a real cave painting, but it is based on them. This is an example from the Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. This is a tortoise motif that was carved onto a piece of architecture in Thailand. Here we have a bird taking a bath from an ancient Chinese painting. And that was a very small sample of works done by artists about animals. That was 3 works of art out of tens of thousands of works of art that involve animals. And it's easy to see why animals have fascinated people for so long. But they've also fascinated scientists. Now, I know that I have told my students before that art does not exist without science. In order to make art, we need supplies and materials which come from chemistry, and the way that they interact with each other often causes chemical reactions, which creates our beautiful work. So science is one of those really cool things that I love to dive into. And sometimes it's really fun to look at how artists help scientists. So within science, we know that there's lots of different categories. And one of them is biology. And a subcategory of biology is zoology, which is the study of animals. And way back in what we call the olden days, in the Victorian era, there were artists that worked on these beautiful line drawings and watercolor drawings that helped zoologists to document all of the wonderful new species of plants, animals, and fungi that were being discovered. We're going to look at 2 examples really quick, and then we're going to get started on our project, which is actually going to be based off of these types of watercolor line drawings. Here are 2 examples of that Victorian line drawing and watercolor painting that I was talking about. I don't know why I chose these 2. I guess maybe because they both had 8 limbs, and that was what was speaking to me while I was choosing examples for our project today. But one of the really cool things about these works of art is their mix of line drawing and beautifully blended color. So just take a few minutes to kind of look. In fact, this would be a good place to pause to do that. And if you're able to grab a grown-up and have them help you search for more examples of this type of artwork, it's absolutely fascinating, and it really does show how art has helped different areas of science.
So what we're going to be doing for this lesson is we are going to be doing an animal adaptation project. And an adaptation is something that an animal does to help it survive in its habitat. We're going to have some fun with this today because after all, it is an art problem, not just a science project. And we are going to pick an animal from our communities, so something that lives nearby, and we are going to pretend it needs to evolve to live in a different habitat. And so we're going to have to learn things about the animal we choose, and we're going to have to learn things about the habitat we choose, and then we're going to make changes to the animal so that it could survive in that habitat. And so in my case, I am going to pick the animal from my local area, which is a rattlesnake, because my son loves rattlesnakes. And the other thing that I'm going to pick is my habitat, which is the place that an animal lives. And I am going to pick an Arctic habitat because my son always asks me, "Mommy, why don't snakes live in the Arctic?" And I figure, well, this will be a great project to maybe learn why and to learn what a snake would have to do in order to adapt to live in the Arctic. you can choose any animal that lives nearby where you live, and you can pick any type of habitat. And remember, a habitat is a place where an animal lives that has a specific climate and has the things that it needs to live and survive. So you can pick any habitat, or you could flip this around and you could pick an animal that lives far away from where you live and see how it would have to adapt to live where you do. So for this project today, you guys are going to need a couple of things. You're going to need some notebook paper, a small sketchbook or pieces of scrap paper that you can use for brainstorming, a pencil, watercolors, and of course water to go with them. And you will also need something to paint on. For our research page, we are going to need to take our piece of research paper and divide it in half. On one side, putting the animal that we've chosen to do, and on the other side, the habitat. And the very first thing you're going to do is write down all the things you already know about your animal and about the habitat that you have chosen. Okay, now that you have done what you already know, you need to think about what do you need to know to do this project. Now remember, we're taking our animal and we're trying to see what adaptations it would need to live in our habitat. So you might now need to actually do a little bit of research, but first you're going to want to think of questions that you want to answer. For example, how is your animal going to get food? How is your animal going to hide from predators? In my case, I have a cold-blooded animal that I'm putting in a very, very cold place. How is it going to stay warm? So I'm going to write that one down, warm. How is it going to stay warm? And I know that there are lots of large predators in the Arctic, but there don't seem to be a lot of small animals for my snake to eat. So what is it going to eat? Now what I need to do is go and do some research to find out what other animals do to adapt to these situations in the Arctic and how my snake could develop those adaptations. All right, so now I have my research done, and I actually learned quite a lot while I was looking this up. And I actually learned quite a lot while I was doing this. I learned that there is actually a type of snake that lives in the Himalayas in hot springs, and that there are hot springs in Alaska, which is part of the Arctic, that there are rodents that Arctic foxes eat, and that a lot of animals use thick fur to keep warm in the Arctic. So over on my side here, I wrote down lots of adaptations or things that I thought my snake might need if it's going to live in the Arctic. And now it's time to do our brainstorming. Alright, so on our brainstorming page, we need to do just a few things. Because now what we're doing is planning our picture that we're going to create. We already found our information, but now we have to put it to use and create our animal that has all of the adaptations that we wanted to have. So we're going to divide this into 3 boxes. Okay. In the top box, we are going to start creating our animal. We're going to think about all of the things that our animal needs to adapt to the climate that we are going to put them in. So I thought that my animal might need to dig for food, but since snakes have no legs, I'm going to make it so that the top of the snake's head is actually kind of shovel shaped. There we go. And it's still going to have its long body, but I'm going to give it some fuzzy fur. Now, I know that in real life, a snake living in the Arctic isn't possible, and your animal might not actually be possible either, but that's okay. This project is all about exploring animal adaptations and what our animals could do if they existed, not necessarily creating animals that actually exist. And I want my rattlesnake to keep its rattle. Otherwise it would not be a rattlesnake, and it's got to scare away polar bears somehow. And I think that's probably about it. Now, some of my research also taught me that animals that live in the Arctic often have to smell their food from really far away. And I also learned that rattlesnakes are related to pit vipers, which have these like pits on the side of their head that help them scoop up smells through their tongue. So I'm going to want to make sure that I still have that so that my rattlesnake can still find some food in the Arctic. And in our second and third boxes, we're going to start planning the background of our picture. Because we do want these to be a little bit more interesting than just, here's my animal painted in pretty colors. We're going to kind of give it a little bit more. So in the first box, I want you to plan what's going to be behind your animal. And in this box, I'm going to plan what's in front of the animal. Now remember, you guys can pause this at any time and come back when you are ready. I'm going to do my behind and in front, and then we'll move on to the next step. So I think behind my snake, I'm going to have a hot spring, and maybe, I know that hot springs come from volcanic activity, so maybe I have a volcano in the background and the rest of some of the mountain range. And this is all stuff that you guys can do in research as well when you're learning about the habitat that you want your animal to live in. And in front of them, honestly, I think I'm just going to have a couple little rocks and maybe some tiny plants that would be living along the edges of the hot spring as well. They're not going to be very big plants. So just some quick ideas of what we could put down. And then it'll be time to do the line drawing part of our project. So when we start our line drawing part, we're going to have our brainstorm nearby so we can see all of the things that we're going to need to draw. And keep in mind, friends, that a line drawing is exactly what it sounds like. It is a very simplified drawing made with just lines. And it's been used for research for a very long time because it's a fast and easy way to record things rather quickly, and in a way that you can get a lot of detail without a lot of hassle, which is sort of ideal if you're working in a field and you're trying to get things down before, your little critter that you're documenting hops away. And just like any other drawing, when we start a line drawing, we're going to start with the things in the front, then go to the things that we're probably going to have in the middle, and then in the things that we have in the back. And we do that so that we can create what's called overlap. And remember, overlap is when you have things where there's one over top of the other, showing distance. You've got something that looks like it's farther away because it is behind something that's in front. So I'm going to start with just a quick little addition here of my rocks and those little plants that I talked about. And keep your drawing very simple. Anything that you want to add detail-wise, we can do with the paint in a little bit. Remember, you're not just documenting like your biological details here, you're also still being an artist. So have fun with your picture. If you feel like the plant should be flowing one way or another, let them do that. Maybe another one lives over here. I don't know. Maybe this is a different kind of tree or branch going on. And then I'm going to move on to making my animal. And you guys should do the same thing. Once you're done the stuff that's in the front, you're going to go back in and add your animal. And I think what I'm going to do is have my little animal dude kind of like swirling up over here and stalking up on something. Maybe there's a mouse over here that it's hunting. And things can go off the page if you want them to. I actually decided I don't like that. So I'm just going to move it. We're working in pencil, so we can do that. But remember, friends, when you're working in pencil, only erase if you really, really have to. If you can go back over top of something, like I just did right there, I made a tiny mistake. I made that round when I wanted it pointed. Just going to go over top of it, and I'm not going to worry about erasing it. So if we worry about erasing, we're going to spend the whole time we're working on our project with an eraser and not a lot of time with paint, which is like no fun. I'm going to start adding little fuzzy wuzzies here. Start making it so he's going behind these leaves. You guys see how I'm skipping? So when you skip what you've already drawn, it makes whatever you're drawing look like it is behind what you drew before, and that's that overlap that I'm talking about. I think it's just going to keep going back over here. And maybe his tail. Sticking up back here with his rattle. Just so we can still tell he's a rattlesnake. Although in real life, when a rattlesnake is hunting, they keep their rattle super quiet because they don't want to spook their prey. These are really cool things that we learn when we do research. And then we'll have a little Arctic mousey. Sorry, little Arctic mousey, I think you're going to have a pretty bad day. And if any time you need to look up what something looks like, as long as you have your grown-up helping you, there is no problem with that. But remember, don't do internet research without your grown-up's help. Alright, there's my cute little mousey. And then we have the hot spring. I'll make some pebbles and things over here, and I'll add more with my watercolors. This is just to get the idea down and give it some depth underneath the watercolors. That's what the line drawing does for our watercolor. It gives a little bit of depth underneath it and makes it so that even if our paint spreads a bit, we can still see what's going on in the picture. And that's our water, which again will add more detail to with our paint. And then back here, it's our big old volcano. And its other little mountain friends. And this is Alaska, so I make big pointy Alaskan mountains. And then we can always go back in and erase the things that we want to get rid of. And you'll notice I did change a little bit from my brainstorm, but that's always okay. And now we're ready to paint. As we begin to paint, friends, please remember that electronics and water are not friends. You are going to notice that my water is not on screen because that would be way too close to my computer if I would spill it. So it's off screen a little bit. And I'm also going to keep my paints close to my water just to minimize spillage. And watercolors are a really fun type of paint to work with. I just have, honestly, a cheap little Dollar Tree set of paints here. And we're going to work with some color blending, which is when you mix two colors together or more colors. We're going to talk about lights and darks and shading and how you get those. Shading is where shadows are. Lights would be the lighter tones of our paint and where it looks like the light is coming in and hitting. We talk about that in pretty much every project we do in my classroom, is how we add highlights and shadows and make things look like they're 3D even though they're on a flat space. And again, 3D is three-dimensional, or looks like it pops up. So the first thing we're going to do is start painting the stuff behind. And then we're going to work down. And basically, friends, I'm just going to give you a couple of watercolor tips and then let you work kind of independently on your watercolors paintings. So to start with watercolors, you always want to get your paintbrush wet and dip into the color that you are choosing to use. Now I'm going to use some blue to do my sky. And you're making a little puddle. It's just a little puddle in where your paint is. And the more of the paint you scoop into the puddle, the darker your paint is going to be. And the more water you use, the lighter your paint is going to be. And I'm going to start by outlining my image in the back, which is why line drawing with this has some good qualities to it, because it helps you not only kind of show depth in your picture underneath the paint, but it also helps you know where you want the paint to go. And if you're just learning how to do watercolor paints, doing them without doing a drawing first can be pretty challenging. So you'll see how I'm just kind of filling in some spaces, but not all of the spaces. And that's because I'm about to show you guys another watercolor technique that helps you spread paint, and that's by just going back over it with water. So I have really thick paint, and then I can spread it with just some water to make it thinner. And that is actually one way to create lights and darks. So it's kind of giving the impression of a sky. And then we're going to move on down to the other part. So we always clean our brush before we change colors. And I am flipping to some brown, so I'm going to make a puddle in my brown. And to make that puddle, I'm just scooping up water and putting it into the little container. And then I'm going to do a similar thing that I did before, where I'm going to fill part of it. And then go back in. But this time as I go back in, I'm going to be paying attention to where I want my light source to be. So I'm choosing for my light source to be over here, coming in. And remember, a light source is where the light is coming from in your picture. So if the sun were right here, it would be shining this direction. Now, my sun is obviously not on my paper. It would be somewhere all the way over there. And I'm actually going to put more paint on the side where I want it to be darker. And now I just spread my paint out, starting from the dark side and moving it to the light side. And I can even go back in and add a deep shadow. And a deep shadow means it's very, very dark. By coming in with a little bit of another color. And as long as my first color is still wet, that is going to blend, which means mix together. And you'll have a beautiful little shadow. I'm actually going to really shadow the caldera. The caldera is the part of a volcano that is left behind by the last eruption. So it's that little crater on the top. And I can go back in with some thicker paint again and outline that part. Now some of my mountains, I want to make it look like they have snow on them, because this is Alaska after all. I'm just going to do some dry brushing, which is just where you take just a little bit of paint on your brush. So it makes these like little streaky doodads going on. So it's just a little paint on my brush. I'm just sort of flicking it to add just a little tiny bit of color. And it's kind of a stretchy, textured color because of the dry brushing. And if I wanted to add shadow to my snow, I'll just go with a little blue. Blue makes a really nice snow shadow. So does purple. You're a purple fan. I'll blend in some purple. There we go. And now I'm ready to start moving down my picture. And that's basically what you're going to do. And just like any other type of painting, you're going to start in the back and work down. It's backwards from drawing. In drawing, you start with what is closest and you work up. In painting, you start with what is farthest away and work down. I want to show you one more watercolor technique that could be helpful before I just let you guys finish on your own. And that is a technique where you paint with water into a spot that you want the paint to go first, and then add the watercolor on top. So I have painted all this little swirl area with water. So I've made it wet. And now I'm going to come back in with my paint and see how the paint spreads into the area that's already been painted. Kind of just drifts in. And what that's letting me do with this is kind of get a water texture that I like. You can use this technique for many different things. I will probably actually use this for the fur technique as well. You see how it's just a little bit like edgy around some of the sides. Looks a little fuzzy. That is because of the way the water is wicking the paint into different sections. And that's why this technique gives a different sort of texture, because the water is pulling the paint as opposed to the paint soaking into the paper. It's a fun technique to experiment with. In fact, if you have never used watercolors before you go ahead and work on your painting, I would actually recommend doing just a little bit of experimentation. Just sort of doing some free painting before you pick up your watercolors and your paintbrush. And if you don't have watercolors, you don't have to use watercolors. You could do this with pencils and crayons and any other thing you have at home to make art with. Do not have to do this with watercolors. Unless you're doing this in a classroom with your teacher and your teacher is telling you that, there's a certain set of supplies that you're using. That's up to your teacher. It's her space or his space. Their space. It's their space. You'll see I'm doing a little bit of green. As we remember from our color wheel, green is next door to blue because it takes blue to make green. So green mixes very well with blue. I'm just sort of using it to add a little bit more depth to my water. Having all one color in something can kind of be boring. So I'm just giving it a little bit more flavor by adding a little bit of green. I could use purple too, but for some reason to me, water feels more blue-green than blue-violet. It's one of those, I don't know why, it just does. And so now, guys, you're just going to keep painting down your paper to fill in all of the spaces. And I will see you when you're done. Okay, boys and girls, I hope that you enjoyed doing this project. I know I certainly did. It was fun to learn about, reasons that snakes can't really live in the Arctic and what maybe they would have to do to live there. And it was really fun to actually design and make our animals. Teachers who may be watching this, connect with your art teacher and see what it would be like to create a rubric together to kind of assess what's going on, figure out what qualifications you want to have and what qualifications the art teacher needs to have to make this lesson work for both of you. And boys and girls who are just following along, if you want to send me what you are working on, I will always want to take a look at it. Have fun and go do a thing.